Maya Johnson, a successful attorney, left her office around 9 p.m. after wrapping up the final tasks for a major case. She stepped out of the high-rise building housing the prestigious law firm she co-founded. The night sky was dim, illuminated only by the faint glow of streetlights. The late autumn breeze sent a chill through the air, causing Maya to shiver slightly. She tightened the wool scarf around her neck and walked briskly toward her car, a sleek black luxury SUV. On her way home, Maya felt a sense of relief. She looked forward to a peaceful evening, a simple meal, a glass of red wine, and the book she had been eager to finish. But life has a way of derailing even the best-laid plans. As her SUV approached a quiet intersection, Maya noticed flashing red and blue lights in the distance. A police patrol car emerged behind her. At first, she thought they were responding to an emergency, but moments later, the siren blared, and the flashing lights were directed at her. Frowning, Maya sighed and slowly pulled over to the side of the road. Lowering her window, she was met with the glare of a flashlight beaming into her rearview mirror from the patrol car. A police officer stepped out and approached her vehicle. He was tall, with a cold demeanor and an unmistakably rude expression. Maya could feel the tension in the air. "License and registration," he said curtly, his tone devoid of any politeness. Maya remained calm. "Good evening, officer. May I ask what I did wrong?" she inquired, her voice composed but tinged with surprise. "You were speeding," he replied, though Maya knew that wasn't true. She had been monitoring her speed and was certain she hadn't broken any traffic laws. Still, she chose not to argue. "All right, here are my documents," Maya said, reaching into her purse for her wallet. "Move slowly. I don't want you doing anything stupid," Officer Thomas Carter barked, his hand already resting on the grip of his gun, as if she were some kind of threat. Maya felt a surge of anger rise within her but kept her face neutral. She handed over her documents calmly. Thomas examined the papers, then looked at Maya with suspicion. "What are you doing with this car? Are you sure it's yours?" The question cut deep into Maya's dignity. She immediately recognized that this wasn't a routine traffic stop. It was racial profiling thinly disguised. "I am the rightful owner of this vehicle, if that's what you're implying," Maya replied, her voice low and firm. Thomas smirked, his lips curling in a condescending grin. "You're a lawyer? Doesn't seem like it. I think you should step out of the vehicle." Maya was forced to step out of her car. Officer Thomas ordered her to stand against the vehicle, arms spread out like a criminal. A chilling sensation ran down her spine, not just from the cold weather but from the humiliation she was enduring. "Is anyone with you? Got anything suspicious in the car?" Thomas asked, his tone dripping with disdain. "No, I'm just on my way home," Maya replied, striving to stay calm. But Thomas didn't care. He searched her purse, rummaged through the seats, and even checked the trunk. Every action was laced with a subtle insult. Maya stood still, but inside, she was boiling with anger. From a distance, a young white woman stopped and began recording the entire scene on her phone. Maya noticed her, but there was nothing she could do except hope the video might serve as evidence if things escalated further. After finding nothing suspicious, Thomas still didn't relent. "I'd advise you not to think about filing a complaint. Don't get any ideas that a lawyer like you can do anything about this." Maya bit her lip, holding back tears. She felt the pain and anger coursing through her. She couldn't believe that after all she had accomplished in life, she was still being treated as less than human, all because of her skin color. When she was finally allowed to leave, Maya sat silently in her car for a long time. She didn't start the engine or move from the driver's seat. Her mind replayed every detail of the incident, from Thomas's contemptuous look to his cold, demeaning voice. Tears streamed down her face, not from fear but from the sheer injustice of what she had just endured. The next morning, Maya woke up feeling heavy-hearted. However, when she checked her phone, she realized that a video of her had gone viral on social media. In just a few hours, It had amassed hundreds of thousands of views, shares, and comments. The woman who recorded the video had posted it with the caption, "Watch how the police treat a woman just because of her skin color. This needs to stop." Public outrage erupted across social media platforms. The hashtag Justice for Maya began trending and quickly gained momentum. Human rights organizations spoke out, demanding an investigation into Thomas's behavior and the police department's practices. Maya felt a mix of surprise and comfort. She realized she was not alone. However, she also knew that she was about to face an uphill battle. That very morning, Maya reached out to David Morales, a renowned civil rights attorney she had long admired. David listened to Maya's story with deep concern. "You have very clear evidence, Maya. I believe we have a strong chance to seek justice not just for you, but for so many others," David said. Maya and David began strategizing for a lawsuit. She was determined not only to resolve her own case but also to expose the systemic injustices within law enforcement. David advised her to brace herself for a long and intense legal battle. "I'm ready," Maya said firmly. "I won't let them get away with this." The legal fight began there, with Maya stepping forward not just as a victim but as a leader in the movement against injustice. Thomas Carter sat alone in the dimly lit corner of his kitchen, nursing a glass of whiskey. The events of the previous night played on a loop in his mind. He had been in this position countless times before, pulling over a driver, searching their car, asserting authority. But this time was different. The video that surfaced online was now a firestorm. His face, his actions, his words all laid bare for the world to see. But Thomas didn't see himself as a villain. Growing up in a small, predominantly white town in rural Alabama, Thomas had learned to view the world through a specific lens. His father, a retired police officer himself, often spoke about maintaining order and control, especially in the face of certain kinds of people. Those words, laced with prejudice, had shaped Thomas's worldview. Flashbacks from his childhood came rushing back. He remembered how his father once told him to avoid those neighborhoods in the nearby city. "They're not like us," his father had said, the tone making it clear who he meant. Thomas had absorbed those lessons without question. To him, being a police officer was about upholding the traditions passed down through his family. He believed he was keeping the streets safe, never pausing to examine how deeply prejudice had infected his actions. But now, with his name trending on social media for all the wrong reasons, Thomas couldn't help but feel the walls closing in. His colleagues were divided. Some supported him, brushing off the incident as just another routine stop, while others began to distance themselves, fearing the fallout. His wife, Emily, had tried to comfort him, but even she seemed uneasy. The silence at their dinner table that night was deafening. "Do you think I went too far?" Thomas asked, breaking the silence. Emily hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe you didn't need to push her like that." Her words stung. For the first time, Thomas began to question not just his actions but the values he had been taught all his life. The precinct was buzzing the next morning. As Thomas walked in, he felt the stares. The whispers were not subtle, and the tension in the air was palpable. Some officers gave him a nod of solidarity, while others avoided his gaze entirely. He overheard snippets of conversations. Words like lawsuit, suspended, and public outcry hung in the air like storm clouds. Captain Reynolds, a grizzled veteran who had been Thomas's mentor, called him into his office. "Carter," the captain began, his voice stern, "this is serious. That video is everywhere. The department is under fire, and they're looking for someone to blame." Thomas clenched his fists. "With all due respect, sir, I was just doing my job." "Were you?" Reynolds shot back, his tone sharp. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you let your biases get the better of you, and now we're all paying the price." The conversation left Thomas simmering with frustration. He left the captain's office and headed to the break room, where a heated argument was underway. Officer Daniels, one of Thomas's closest allies, was defending him against Officer Rivera, who had been openly critical. Carter's not a bad guy, Daniels argued. He just got caught in a bad situation. A bad situation? Rivera snapped. Come on, Daniels. You've seen him. He targets minorities all the time. This isn't new. Thomas stepped in, his voice icy. If you've got something to say, Rivera, say it to my face. Rivera didn't back down. Fine. I think you're exactly the kind of cop that gives the rest of us a bad name. The room fell silent. Thomas stormed out, his anger boiling over. But Rivera's words lingered, planting seeds of doubt in his mind. Meanwhile, Maya sat in a conference room with David Morales and their team of legal experts. The walls were covered with printouts of the video, police reports, and other materials they had gathered. Maya's determination was palpable. This isn't just about me, she said, pacing the room. This is about a system that allows people like him to operate with impunity. We're going to hold him accountable, not just for what he did to me, but for everyone who's ever been in my position. David nodded. We have a strong case, but we need to be strategic. The police department is already trying to frame this as an isolated incident. We need to prove that this is part of a larger pattern. They began mapping out their approach. The first step was to gather testimonies from others who had experienced similar treatment at the hands of Officer Carter. Maya reached out to community organizations, advocacy groups, and even social media networks to find potential witnesses. One by one, stories began to emerge. A young black man recounted how Thomas had pulled him over for a broken taillight and ended up searching his car without cause. A Latina woman shared a similar story about being berated and humiliated in front of her children. Each account painted a damning picture of Thomas's behavior, reinforcing the systemic issues Maya was determined to expose. Maya also knew she had to prepare herself for the inevitable smear campaign. They're going to come after me, she told David. They'll dig into my past, twist my words, and try to make me look like the problem. David placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Let them try. The truth is on our side. The courtroom was packed on the day of the first hearing. Journalists filled the gallery, their cameras clicking incessantly as Maya walked in. Flanked by her legal team, across the room, Thomas sat with his own lawyers, his expression a mixture of defiance and unease. The proceedings began with opening statements. David spoke passionately about the need for accountability, laying out the facts of the case with precision. This is not just about one officer's actions, he said. It's about a culture that allows and even encourages this kind of behavior. Thomas's lawyer, a sharp-tongued man named Carl Henson, took a different approach. He painted Maya as overly sensitive, suggesting that she had exaggerated the incident for attention. My client was simply doing his job, Henson argued. This entire case is a baseless attack on law enforcement. Maya sat quietly, her hands clenched in her lap. She refused to let Henson's words shake her resolve. As witnesses were called, the atmosphere grew tense. The young black man Maya had spoken to earlier testified first, recounting his encounter with Thomas in vivid detail. He treated me like a criminal, the man said, his voice trembling, all because of the color of my skin. Thomas avoided eye contact, staring down at the table in front of him. By the end of the day, it was clear that the case was far from over, but Maya felt a spark of hope. For the first time, she could see a path forward, a path to justice not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced. The morning after the first hearing, the case became the focus of national news. Major networks aired segments about the courtroom drama, interviews with Maya's legal team, and discussions about systemic racism in law enforcement. However, what truly captivated the public was the emergence of new evidence. A whistleblower within the police department came forward anonymously. The individual, referred to only as Officer X, provided internal emails and reports that painted a disturbing picture of Thomas Carter's history. These documents showed that Thomas had been the subject of multiple complaints over the years, allegations of racial profiling, excessive force, and inappropriate conduct. Each time, the department had either dismissed the complaints or quietly settled them out of court. When Maya and David reviewed the new evidence, they were stunned. "This isn't just about Thomas anymore," David said, spreading the documents across the conference table. "This implicates the entire department." Maya felt a surge of both anger and determination. "We need to bring this to light. Every single person who covered for him needs to be held accountable." The legal team adjusted their strategy. Instead of solely focusing on Thomas, they began building a case against the broader culture of the police department. Maya reached out to investigative journalists, ensuring that the story would reach as many people as possible. Meanwhile, Thomas was grappling with his own turmoil. He had seen the news reports and felt the growing weight of public scrutiny. For the first time, he began to question the integrity of the system he had devoted his life to. He thought about his father's lessons and how they had shaped his views. Was he wrong all along? The question gnawed at him, but he wasn't ready to face the answer. Thomas sat in his car outside his home, the engine idling. He had been avoiding going inside for hours. Emily had grown distant, their conversations tense and strained. Their daughter, Sophie, had begun asking questions he didn't know how to answer. "Daddy, why are people on TV saying you're mean to people who look like Maya?" Sophie had asked one evening, her innocent eyes filled with confusion. Thomas had been struck silent. How could he explain something he was still struggling to understand himself? As he sat there, he received a text from an old friend and former colleague, Mark Hastings. Mark had retired from the force a few years earlier, disillusioned by the department's lack of accountability. His message was simple: "Can we talk? It's time you faced the truth." Reluctantly, Thomas agreed to meet Mark at a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. Over coffee, Mark laid everything out. "You think you're just doing your job, don't you?" Mark began, his voice calm but firm. "But you're not. You're perpetuating a cycle of injustice. And deep down, I think you know that." Thomas bristled. "I don't target anyone. I just follow protocol." Mark shook his head. "That's what we all tell ourselves. But protocol isn't neutral. It's designed to enforce control over certain communities. You think it's a coincidence that most of your stops are Black or Latino drivers?" Thomas didn't respond. He stared into his coffee, the words sinking in. "You have a chance to do the right thing," Mark continued. "But it starts with admitting you were wrong." Thomas left the diner feeling more conflicted than ever. The foundation of his beliefs was cracking, and he wasn't sure if he could handle the collapse. As the case gained momentum, Maya found herself under attack. Thomas's legal team launched a full-scale smear campaign, digging into every aspect of her life. Old photos, out-of-context statements, and even false rumors began circulating online. The goal was clear: discredit Maya and shift the focus away from the real issues. One morning, Maya woke up to find her email inbox flooded with hateful messages, threats, slurs, and vitriol poured in from anonymous senders. She felt a pang of fear but quickly reminded herself why she was fighting. David called her later that day. "Maya, we need to talk about security. This is getting serious." "I'm not backing down," Maya said firmly. "They can't scare me into silence." Despite her resolve, the attacks took a toll. Maya began having trouble sleeping, her mind racing with thoughts of what could happen next. Her family and friends rallied around her, offering support and encouragement. Her younger brother, Jamal, who had always been fiercely protective, moved in temporarily to keep her company. "You're the strongest person I know," Jamal said one evening as they sat on the couch. "They can't break you." Maya nodded, drawing strength from his words. She knew that the fight wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had been silenced, marginalized, and mistreated. The courtroom was packed once again as the second major hearing began. This time, Maya's team presented the new evidence they had obtained from Officer X. The internal documents were damning, revealing not only Thomas's history but also the department's systemic failures. David stood before the court, his voice steady and commanding. What we see here is not the result of one bad apple. It is the result of a system that enables and protects misconduct. Officer Carter's actions are a symptom of a much larger disease. Thomas's lawyer, Carl Henson, tried to dismiss the evidence as irrelevant, but the judge allowed it to be admitted. The courtroom buzzed with tension as David called Officer X to the stand. The whistleblower, their identity concealed for protection, testified about the culture within the department. "It's an open secret," Officer X said. "We're taught to view minorities as suspects first and people second. And when someone speaks up, they're either silenced or pushed out." The testimony was a turning point. Maya watched as the jury members exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of shock and disbelief. For the first time, she felt the tide beginning to turn. Thomas, sitting at the defense table, looked visibly shaken. The words of Officer X echoed in his mind, aligning with what Mark had told him. He couldn't deny it any longer. He had been complicit in something deeply wrong. As the hearing ended for the day, Maya stepped outside into a sea of reporters and supporters. She felt a surge of hope. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, she believed that justice was within reach. The hearing's revelations sent shockwaves through the community. Maya's case was no longer just a legal battle. It had become a rallying cry for change. Across the city, people began organizing protests, vigils, and town hall meetings to address the systemic racism within the police force. One such protest took place in front of the courthouse, where a diverse crowd gathered, holding signs with messages like "Justice for All" and "End Police Brutality." Maya, though hesitant at first, decided to attend and address the crowd. Standing on the courthouse steps, she felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on her. "I didn't ask for this fight," she began, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "But I won't walk away from it. What happened to me is not an isolated incident. It's part of a larger pattern, one that has stolen dignity, freedom, and even lives from people who look like me." The crowd erupted in applause, but Maya wasn't finished. This isn't just about holding one officer accountable. It's about dismantling the structures that allow prejudice to flourish. It's about demanding a system that protects all of us, not just some of us. Her speech was met with cheers, and many in the crowd shared their own stories of mistreatment. A mother tearfully recounted how her son had been wrongfully arrested. An older man described being harassed by police simply for sitting on a park bench. Each story added fuel to the movement, strengthening Maya's resolve. Meanwhile, local news channels covered the protest extensively, further amplifying Maya's message. But not everyone was supportive. Online, detractors accused her of stirring unrest, and some even blamed her for tarnishing the reputation of law enforcement. Maya braced herself for the backlash, knowing it was part of the fight. As Maya's legal team delved deeper into the department's records, they uncovered something that left them stunned. Among the documents provided by Officer X was a memo from a senior official instructing officers to focus patrols in predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods. The language was coded, but the intent was clear. Racial profiling was not just tolerated, it was policy. David paced the conference room, holding the memo like a piece of dynamite. "This changes everything," he said. "We're not just dealing with a rogue officer. We're dealing with institutionalized racism." Maya nodded, her mind racing. "If we present this in court, it won't just implicate Thomas. It'll expose the entire leadership." But David was cautious. "We need to be strategic. If we go too hard, too fast, they'll do everything they can to bury this." Despite the risk, Maya insisted on including the memo in their case. "People deserve to know the truth," she said firmly. "This is bigger than me." The next hearing was electrifying. David presented the memo, walking the jury through its implications step by step. The courtroom buzzed with tension as he explained how the policy disproportionately targeted minorities, leading to incidents like Maya's. Thomas's lawyer objected repeatedly, trying to discredit the evidence, but the judge allowed it to stand. The atmosphere was thick with unease as the department's actions were laid bare for all to see. For Thomas, it was a moment of reckoning. Sitting at the defense table, he realized that the system he had devoted his life to was far more corrupt than he had ever imagined. The memo confirmed what Mark and Officer X had been trying to tell him. He wasn't just complicit, he was a cog in a broken machine. At home, Thomas's personal life was unraveling. Emily had been watching the hearings closely, and the memo was the final straw. One evening, after putting Sophie to bed, she confronted him in the living room. "I can't do this anymore, Thomas," she said, her voice trembling. "I've stood by you, defended you, but now, I don't even know who you are." Thomas looked at her, his face lined with exhaustion. "I'm the same man I've always been." "No, you're not," Emily shot back. "Or maybe you are, and I was too blind to see it. You've spent years justifying behavior that's hurting people, and now it's hurting us." Tears welled up in her eyes as she continued. "What am I supposed to tell Sophie when she asks why her father is on trial? What am I supposed to tell her about the kind of man you are?" Thomas tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. He knew she was right. The cracks in their marriage had been forming for years, but now they were irreparable. The next morning, Emily packed a suitcase for herself and Sophie. As she walked out the door, she looked back at Thomas one last time. "I hope you find a way to fix this," she said quietly. "For your sake, and ours." Thomas watched them drive away, his heart heavy with regret. Alone in the empty house, he finally allowed himself to break down, sobbing into his hands. For the first time, he admitted to himself that he had lost everything, and it was his own fault. The courtroom was filled to capacity as the next phase of the trial began. The department's senior officials had been subpoenaed, and their testimony promised to be explosive. Maya sat with David, her heart pounding as the first official took the stand. Under questioning, the official tried to downplay the memo, calling it a poorly worded directive that had been misinterpreted. But David was relentless. He produced emails, meeting minutes, and witness testimony that contradicted the official's claims. "Let's be clear," David said, his voice ringing through the courtroom. "This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate policy designed to target certain communities. And Officer Carter's actions are a direct result of that policy." The official squirmed under the scrutiny, his answers becoming increasingly evasive. The jury watched intently, their expressions a mix of shock and outrage. Meanwhile, Thomas sat silently, his gaze fixed on the floor. He felt like a puppet whose strings had been cut, powerless to defend himself against the truth. Every piece of evidence, every damning testimony, chipped away at his remaining sense of justification. When it was his turn to testify, Thomas hesitated. He had planned to stick to the script his lawyer had prepared, but something inside him shifted. As he took the stand, he looked directly at Maya. "I was wrong," he said, his voice trembling. "I see that now. What I did to you was inexcusable. And I'm sorry." The courtroom fell silent. Even Maya was momentarily stunned by his admission. Thomas continued, his words spilling out in a torrent. "I was part of a system that taught me to see people like you as threats. I didn't question it because it was easier not to. But I can't live with that anymore." His confession sent shockwaves through the room. For Maya, it was a moment of validation, but also a reminder of how deeply ingrained the problem was. As the day ended, Maya stepped outside into the cool evening air. Reporters clamored for comments, but she ignored them, lost in thought. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that real change was possible. Thomas's unexpected confession in court became the headline of the day, sparking a wave of reactions from both sides. For Maya, The moment was bittersweet. While his apology felt genuine, it didn't erase the trauma or the systemic issues that enabled his behavior. However, it marked a turning point, not just for the trial but for Thomas himself. The day after his testimony, Thomas walked into a community center in a predominantly black neighborhood. It was a place he had never set foot in before, but now he was there with a purpose. The director, a middle-aged man named Marcus Fields, greeted him with a wary look. "I'm here to listen," Thomas said simply. "I need to understand." Marcus studied him for a moment before nodding. "Then you'd better be ready for some hard truths." Thomas spent the day attending a forum where community members shared their experiences with police brutality and racial profiling. He heard stories that mirrored Maya's but also ones far more harrowing. A father spoke about his teenage son being wrongfully arrested and beaten. A woman recounted how her brother was shot during a routine traffic stop. For Thomas, it was a humbling experience. These were people he had once viewed with suspicion, but now he saw their humanity, their pain, resilience, and courage. By the end of the day, he stood up to speak. "I've been part of the problem," he admitted, his voice shaking. "I see that now. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to make things right." His words were met with a mix of skepticism and cautious hope. Marcus approached him afterward and said, "If you're serious about change, this is just the beginning." The trial's final day was a spectacle. The courtroom was packed with journalists, activists, and community members. The tension was palpable as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. Maya sat next to David, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her heart pounded as the judge addressed the jury's findings. After careful consideration of the evidence and testimony presented, the jury has reached a unanimous decision. The judge announced, "We find the defendant, Officer Thomas Carter, guilty of misconduct and violation of civil rights." The courtroom erupted. Maya felt tears streaming down her face as the weight of the moment hit her. It wasn't just a victory for her. It was a victory for everyone who had been silenced and oppressed. The judge continued, addressing the systemic issues revealed during the trial. This court also recognizes the role of the police department's policies in enabling such behavior. As such, an independent oversight committee will be established to review and reform departmental practices. Outside the courthouse, Maya was greeted by a sea of supporters. People cheered, chanted her name, and held signs reading "Justice served" and "Change starts now." For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to smile, a genuine, unguarded smile. But amidst the celebration, Maya felt a pang of exhaustion. She knew this was only the beginning. The fight for justice wasn't over. But for now, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. The verdict sent ripples through the city and beyond. The police department announced a series of immediate reforms, including mandatory bias training, independent investigations of misconduct, and the firing of several senior officials implicated in the scandal. Maya used the momentum to launch a new initiative, a nonprofit organization called Equal Justice Now. The organization provided legal aid to victims of police brutality and advocated for broader systemic changes. Maya threw herself into the work, channeling her pain and anger into something constructive. Meanwhile, Thomas began his journey toward redemption. He resigned from the police force and publicly apologized for his actions, not just to Maya but to the community at large. He started attending workshops on racial justice and even volunteered at the community center where he had first met Marcus. One day, he visited Maya's office, unannounced. She hesitated when she saw him but eventually let him in. "I wanted to thank you," Thomas said, "not for what happened, but for forcing me to see the truth. It's changed my life." Maya regarded him carefully. "It's not about me, Thomas. It's about accountability, and making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." They spoke for over an hour, discussing everything from the trial to the future. While Maya couldn't fully forgive him, she respected his efforts to change. It was a small step toward healing for both of them. Months later, Maya stood on a stage at a national conference on criminal justice reform. Her organization, Equal Justice Now, had grown rapidly, attracting attention from activists, politicians, and celebrities. Maya was now a symbol of resilience and change. Though she remained grounded in her mission, in her keynote address, she reflected on the journey. This fight isn't just about holding individuals accountable. It's about transforming systems. It's about creating a world where justice isn't determined by the color of your skin. The audience erupted in applause, but Maya's mind drifted to the people who had supported her along the way. David, Jamal, Marcus, and even Thomas. Their stories, struggles, and courage had shaped her path. Back in the city, Thomas stood outside the community center, watching a group of children playing basketball. Marcus approached him, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "You've come a long way," Marcus said. "I've got a long way to go," Thomas replied, but there was a hint of a smile on his face. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in a warm glow, both Maya and Thomas found themselves looking toward the future. The road ahead was still fraught with challenges, but for the first time, they saw the possibility of real, lasting change, a light at the end of the tunnel.